All right. Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining with us again for the second part in our series for Juneteenth. In this particular segment, we are going to hear from stalwarts within our communities from a historical standpoint through the present. As we have seen, these are definitely unprecedented times, but the level of enthusiasm and ambition that we see through the protests, that we know that this is not an episode, this is not a moment in history, but this is a movement. And this movement has allowed for the atmosphere to be created for the New York State Legislature to do some historic changes to laws that have had us handcuffed for many, many decades. We know that we repealed the 50A law so that the history, whether disparaging or not, of police officers who are complaints are lodged against them are now allowed to be exposed. It allows now for an opportunity where someone wants to videotape a police encounter, that you have a duty and a right to record. If there's a police officer whose weapon was discharged, they are required now to report that. State police are required to have body cams. I thank the governor for signing my bill today on requiring all New York State police officers to have body cameras, and also it codifies when and where and the circumstances regarding when they have to turn them on. And so we know that there's still a lot to do. We mentioned yesterday that it may have taken us 400 years to get to this point, but all of these advances and all the progress that we've made is going to take us an eternity to protect. But today we have with us Dr. Ben Chavis. Dr. Ben began his career in 1963 as a statewide youth coordinator in North Carolina for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. In 1970, he was appointed to the Southern Region Program as the Southern Region Program Director of the 1.7 million member United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, and by 1985 was named as the executive director of that organization. In 1988, he was the vice president of the National Council of Churches of the USA. In 93 and in 94, he served as the executive director and the CEO for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. In 95, Dr. Chavis was the national director and organizer of the Million Man March. From 95 to 97, he was the executive director and the CEO of the National African American Leadership Summit. We all also know that Dr. Ben has a memorable role as a minister in the movie Belly by Hype Williams. And so it is a pleasure to have you with us here today. And I look forward to the dialogue that we'll be engaging in regarding the state of policing in our country.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Latrice Walker. Um, First, let me just say I'm always glad to be in the presence of freedom fighting sister lawyers. Assemblywoman Walker, you represent the 55th District in Brooklyn, New York, and we appreciate your leadership. You're leading bail reform across the state of New York and other matters. And I know you used to work with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, so please give Congresswoman Yvette Clarke a shout out, and her mother, Una Clarke. And we wish all the brothers and sisters there in Brooklyn, but also across New York City and across the state of New York, our best wishes. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight and on this panel. And I'm joined by one of my favorite uh, intellectual giants of our society, noted Harvard sociologist Dr. Orlando Patterson. I'm just going to go over a few things about Dr. Patterson in case you don't know him. I know him well, but he is the John Clowes Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. He previously held faculty appointments at the University of the West Indies, his alma mater, and the London School of Economics, where he received his PhD. His academic interests include the culture and practices of freedom, comparative study of slavery and ethno-racial relations, and the cultural sociology of poverty and underdevelopment, with special reference to the Caribbean and African American youth. Professor Patterson is the author of numerous academic papers and six major academic books, including Slavery and Social Death, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, The Ordeal of Integration, and the Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. So, Dr. Patterson, we're pleased to have you with us. There'll be some other members that will join. I just understand tonight's purpose is to discuss policing, the past, the present, and the future. And I would just say a word about the past, and then I'll pass on to Dr. Patterson. When our other guests come, I will introduce them. Uh, I've been involved in the civil rights movement in the United States for over 60 some years. And in my own career, I've had many instances with the police. I think uh, last count, I've been arrested 67 times, 67 times, most of which were in the state of North Carolina, state of Virginia, once in Alabama, and once in Mississippi. But mainly in North Carolina, I was arrested multiple times because of my involvement in the civil rights movement. And on each instance, I had obviously altercations with the police. But most notably, because of prosecutorial misconduct, I was a part of a group called the Wilmington, North Carolina 10 in the 1970s, where 10 of us, I was 23 years old at the time, eight young high school students, 16, 17, 18 years old, and Mrs. Shepard, Ann Shepard, who was 26 years old at the time. The 10 of us were sentenced to 282 years in prison. We were political prisoners. You would say, well, why would we receive all that prison time? We didn't violate any laws, but we did protest the racism in the public schools of Wilmington. And there was a riot that occurred. We were attacked by white vigilantes, white supremacists, including the Ku Klux Klan. Instead of the law enforcement people, this was 3 years after Dr. King was killed in '68, this was in 1971. Instead of the law enforcement arresting the perpetrators of the violence on Black people in Wilmington, we were scapegoated, railroaded, and sent to prison all that time. But we refused to give up the struggle, even though it took over a decade for us to prove our innocence. We did not let that break our spirit. So I know firsthand experiences by interchange with police, state police, local police, and federal police. I know what it's like to be held in federal custody and in state custody. I, our case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. I haven't been to law school, but I feel like I've had extensive study of the law from firsthand experience. So I think that when we talk about systemic racism, I hope we don't think that it's only in the police department. It is certainly there, but it is not relegated in isolation to the system of white supremacy and racism that permeates all of American life. And we can get into more details on the past, but I'm just pleased to be in this discussion. And again, I want to thank Congresswoman Walker for her leadership. And this, leading up to Juneteenth, and of course, we all remember not only what happened in Juneteenth, but we all have a new focus on what happened in the 1920s with Rosewood with the uh, terrible massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We had a similar in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 with the Wilmington Massacre. There's a whole series of massacres, whole series of rebellions, whole series, some people call them riots, some people uprisings. And of course, what we're facing today, we'll get into today and the present. But we also have been joined by Brother Michael Partis. Brother Partis, thank you for coming in. I'm going to give you a little longer introduction, but I want to turn now straight to uh, Dr. Patterson. Dr. Patterson, share with us from your perspective. You've done a lot of research on this topic of racism, systemic racism, but mainly, how do you see policing when it comes to Black people in the past, leading into the present moment where we're facing?
Yes, thanks very much for that introduction. And thank you, Assemblywoman Walker. This is a real privilege. It's not often that academics get the chance to descend from their academic rights and actually get engaged with people who are doing real things rather than thinking about and speculating about things. So this is really my pleasure. I mean, I've should point out that I'm an African American. I'm also Jamaican. I grew up in Jamaica, and somewhat different experience there. Although we've got our problems, God knows. But my father was a policeman and a radical policeman. I have a story about him and his work in the colonial police force, and his relationship with Marcus Garvey. But then I've spent most of my life here in this country. Last 50 years of my life has been here. So I have the advantage of being able to compare two different systems, growing up in a Black society, also growing up as a minority person, most of my adult life here. And it's really, I mean, I've always thought that the police, and in sort of trying to understand the society, realize the police is the face of the state. You know, the state has been defined by a great sociologist as possessing the monopoly of legitimate violence in the society. The state is permitted to use violence. It's the only institution. And the police, in a sense, are the agents of the state. And when the police behaves in a certain way towards a particular group, they are in fact representing the states in their behavior. So it's a pleasure to talk with you about what I found about the police. I'm also a student of freedom. Freedom is something which is central to my intellectual and personal development. And, it's just one of the great paradoxes of our time, that the nation which claims to be the leader of the free world has the most number of people incarcerated in the history of the world, more than any other state in history. More than Stalinist Russia at the height of the Gulag Archipelago. I mean, it's just incredible. And an important part of that paradox are the police, which we'll talk about later on. They're central to why America has become a carceral state. So as a sociologist and as a sociologist of freedom and slavery, it's been a subject of central preoccupation to me, how the slaves are treated, how the police behave in perpetuating one of America's original sin, if you like. That's what I want to talk about. I'm sort of happy to have this opportunity to talk not to fellow academics or to students at Harvard, but to people in the real world about this problem. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patterson. And I knew by your accent that you were a Yardie from Jamaica. And I wanted you to know that Jamaica is sort of my second home. And we'll talk about that a little later because the Caribbean has played an invaluable role in helping to raise the consciousness of the struggle for freedom to overcome oppression in the diaspora of African people. And so we're pleased to have you a part of this dialogue. Brother Michael Pottis is a renowned educator. He draws over a decade experience as an educator. He's been an instructor at CUNY, the Borough of Manhattan Community College, a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at CUNY Brooklyn College, and assistant adjunct professor of urban studies at Long Island University at Brooklyn. His academic publications includes articles on Black digital protest movements and racism in 2016 presidential election. Currently, he is a researcher at the Bronx African American History Project, where he and Professor Mark Nason are editing After the Fires, a collection of post-1970 South Bronx oral histories. Brother Partis, welcome to the panel. We're glad to have you, my man. I appreciate your contribution to our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. We're discussing policing. Just jump right in. We're discussing the past, the present, and the future, but we want to hear from you. So welcome to the panel.
Good evening. It's an honor to be with you all this evening. And once again, thank you to Assemblywoman Walker for convening this. And thank you both to be amongst you all in the long Black freedom struggle. And this is just a moment, and hopefully today's dialogue and conversation propels us forward. I think Professor Patterson laid down a really important sort of framework, just two pieces of his work that really will inform this moment for us is we really have to think about policing around the stratification of the society, right? And how does a society create hierarchy to make people who are more worthy and people who are quote unquote less worthy? And we know that in the Americas context, whether it's colonialism or the type of quote unquote democracy we have now, that the framing of people of African descent by calling them Black, we fully understand that that is a way to stratify them and to justify a particular type of oppression that they face. So when we understand that historical component, that what has been legal has been to criminalize people of African descent, no matter free or not, right? But to criminalize them, and we're in a continual process of that. And so that process of law making Blackness, i.e. being of African descent, that process of criminalizing that has allowed the state, like Dr. Patterson mentioned, has allowed the state, the government, to create systems for enforcing laws against our humanity, to enforce laws that try to regulate or control our behavior. And ultimately, that gets expressed publicly into a set of ideas and a set of stories that then criminalize just our humanity. Right. And this is the kind of social death component that, is, more pronounced, I think, in the brutality of enslavement in the Caribbean, but is absolutely seen if you think about the kind of caste system that has developed through law and policing in the United States. So the history, right, from the moment Africans really enter the Americas, and particularly from quote unquote Jamestown, all the way through this moment from 1619, it's not just a New York Times article showcase piece, right? From the kind of moment that the African presence becomes a part of that colonial system, that there's been a growing kind of from slave codes through the Black codes after the Civil War, through Jim Crow to now, that there's a consistent kind of pattern of the law, right, naming those Black people of African descent as criminal, as less worthy, and then policing them through punishment, policing them through exclusion, punishing them through detainment, right? Like this is the continual pattern. So we have to, it's really important for us to have that historical perspective that even as the identity of people of African descent has changed from a color, quote unquote, to a biological description like Negroid, these type of things, through now like our ethnic kind of identity. But the fundamental feature of being of African descent has continued to be something that is criminalized. The way we see that in the current moment is that it's a long tradition from the slave codes, which used law enforcement to capture and control people of African descent, through the black codes, which was made to keep people of African descent in a lower caste system in the United States, through now Jim Crow and new Jim Crow, which is an extra legal system. That kind of patterning is very important for us to remember, because ultimately what we're seeing at this moment is that emancipation continues to be something that we are striving for. Emancipation is to bring an end to that kind of legal patterning of stratifying a society, to say people of African descent are less worthy, they are deserving of oppression, and we can use violence or detainment in order to execute that. We are on a long road towards emancipation, and it didn't just stop when we legally outlawed slavery. It didn't just stop when we had judicial legislation to end civil atrocities against civil rights. And it didn't just end, right, when we reached some of these legal kind of decisions around, 1964 and et cetera. What we really have to understand is that the role for emancipation is really critical on the abolition point. We are still in an emancipatory kind of moment where we have to fight back against all the historical and current ways that people justify this violence towards African Americans and people of African descent. And to conclude the point, it really becomes important in this moment that even if people try to point to the textual kind of analysis of Supreme Court rulings, of legislation, you have to understand how the institution and the system behaves, right? And the institution and the system behaves in such way that it continues to punish and it continues to create the narrative around Blackness being the problem and Blackness deserving violence to and ultimately end our life. And so in the emancipatory moment, we have to really get focused on a lot of the uprisings of what's happened currently to protest the state, the government treating us that way. And then we need, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit, to really get on a liberation kind of framework, like Dr. Patterson mentioned, that the road to freedom is just a little bit of a step beyond the road to emancipation. And that's a narrative that we have to change. And that's a protest and a protest and demonstration and voice we have to speak. And ultimately, venues like this is important for us to push back on the over 400 years in this country.
All right, Brother Potters, thank you so much for your beginning words in our panel. And I'm so glad to see now another freedom fighting lawyer has joined us, Attorney Kenneth Montgomery. After graduating from Fordham Law School in 1997, Kenneth honed his skills as an assistant district attorney in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Brother Montgomery worked in the red zone, which covered high crime areas in the northern section of Brooklyn, including East New York and Flatbush. He also worked in the sex crimes unit, the juvenile designated felony unit, and grand jury and other investigations. He's been a real extensive brother. Also, after leaving the prosecution's office in 2001, Kenneth started his own law firm, specializing in criminal and civil rights litigation and other general litigation. As a talented and well-respected criminal defense attorney in both federal and state court, he's defended defendants and clients who have been charged with very serious felonies, including capital murder and terrorism. We welcome to the panel Attorney Kenneth Montgomery. Welcome, brother.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished guests. It's an honor.
Thank you. We're discussing policing, some of the past, some of the present, and some of the future. What Dr. Patterson and Brother Partis have talked about, and I have a little bit, is how institutionalized, how systematized, how systemic racism is, not only in the policing, but in the whole fabric of American society. So there comes a question, under this circumstances that we're facing in 2020, can the police police the police?
No.
Can the prosecutors prosecute the prosecutors? Can the system be reformed? Some are calling for the system to be dismantled. And of course, when you dismantle something, you better have a clear sense of what it is you want to build in this place, or what it is you want to reform in this place. So, from your experience, Brother Montgomery, share your views on policing and Black America.
I think I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said. When you study, first from a legal standpoint, when you study America, America has always been a white nationalistic experiment. It was created at the exclusion of Black people, people of African descent, and everything about it, the laws. People like to think of America as a democracy. I don't look at it as a democracy. I look at it as a colonial democracy. And in that colonial democracy, its goal and its intent has always been to alienate us socially, politically, and economically. And when you have that as your goal in the groundwork, look, all we need to do is look at the rule of law, which is American jurisprudence is couched in Anglo-Saxon law. And when you look at that and you look at the legal decisions that are made, from Taney's decision, basically saying that a Black person has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, you understand what America has done. And policing is really connected to the brutality of slavery. American slavery was exceptionally brutal for several reasons. Because of the money and the productivity that was generated through slavery. And the police is an extension of that. That's why every time you see a young Black person, an older Black person, it doesn't matter if it's Eleanor Bumpers or if it's Tamir Rice or if it's Clifford Glover, or it's whoever it is, the question is always, well, what did they do? And that, to me, goes back to the racial intent. It's always about the victim. And that's why this has always been about we have no humanity. So now when you have prosecutors working with police in a symbiotic relationship, and now in the digital age, you have a media and which is mixed into that symbiotic relationship, the narrative is that the Black person is to be kept away and controlled. And anyone who has a real comprehensive understanding of American history, there's no way you can walk away from that and say that it's Black people who are the violent people. It just doesn't, it's ludicrous. It's anti-intellectual. It's against the facts. In fact, we've practiced more restraint, if anything. But that is the American narrative, to keep the Black people and some other negative names that have been given to us away from the good people in America, sort of what Michael referred to. And that's what policing is about. And then it's particularly dangerous in this age because, as I said, we're now in a digital age. All that racism, all the bad things are now codified digitally. So now policing in this day and age it's not the cop whistling, twirling the stick. You know, they're doing that, but they're also honing in on your social media. They're also honing in on your phone. They also have a plethora of information that's coming to them, and they're sitting at the table with these prosecutors, with these government officials, and they're pinpointing what areas of the Bronx, what areas of Brooklyn that they need to go in and clean house. And they're then going to the laws, and they're using these laws that traditionally have not really, you know, for instance, federal court, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you would never see 60, 100, 200 Black men hauled into a federal court. It just didn't happen. That was reserved for mobsters. They've now applied that to these young men who have been traditionally, socially, politically, and economically alienated. And when you have a society that's based on our alienation, and you have the police as a vanguard to feed that social caste system, as you said, Dr. Ben, you better have a plan. Because if you don't have a plan, you're simply now dealing with the removal of people from a community.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Attorney Montgomery. Dr. Patterson, this is a good segue. Because of what happened to George Floyd and the fact that it was captured on video, and the fact that that video has been massively disseminated, not just in the United States, but all over the world, you now have hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, more people are marching outside of the United States than inside the United States. We're just not as conscious of it because the media in the United States does not focus on the global criticism. Floyd's brother will be testifying at the United Nations tomorrow. We were called back in the 1950s, another brother named Patterson uh, uh, put a document to the United Nations called We Charge Genocide. William Patterson was his name. Because of what was going on in the 1950s to Black people and to people of African descent. I remember right after the Million Man March, I went down to Jamaica, my second home, and had breakfast with Michael Manley. And we talked about how we are seeing, not just in America, but around the world, how Black people are seen. And certainly the role of police in repressing rather than protecting, the role of police denying the call or the urge for freedom, justice, and equality. So these contradictions, Dr. Patterson, how do you see today and the future? What's the glimpse that hopefully we can strive toward for a better place? I know a lot of our community leaders, including Assemblywoman Walker, who's sponsoring tonight, have introduced bills on bail reform and other matters connected to tonight's discussion. But just as a broad overview, based on all of your studies and research, what is what is your sense of how this will turn out, and what we need to do as Black people to make sure that we're in a better place, not in a worse place, as a result of what is going on the streets of America tonight?
Thank you. It's a big question, but I thought a lot about it, and I have deep sense that this is a really radical movement with great possibilities. What we've had so far, and this includes even the civil rights movement, was reformative movements. We've tried to reform an existing system which had fundamental problems that worked against Black Americans that required more than reform. What I see happening here is, number one, a recognition of the fact that racism is endemic, that it's not just a matter of people's attitudes, but that it's systemic. Now, we talk about systemic racism in sociology, in academic circles, in our policy circles a lot. But you know, what's interesting is to hear people using that term and understanding what it means for the first time. It's gone beyond academia, the understanding that racism is not just a matter of my attitudes, whether I consider Black people equal or not. I can be, in fact, liberal and race, but still supporting an institutional structure that is racist. I think the word has gotten out that is important. That it's not that you have to go and just changing your attitude. You got to change the system.
Mhm.
That secondly, I find that sense has emerged that racism is not just a problem for Black people, that white Americans are complicit in this system, and that it is not just something you want to do for Black people, but it's something you have to do for yourself in terms of changing just how you think, but the system in which you live. And that it's important for you, as a white person, as an Asian person, and so on, uh, that we change the system. And that's reflected in something very unusual. There are two unusual things about what's happening in the streets today. First, it's national, and of course, as you mentioned, it's global, but let's just stick to the national because it's different even from what was going on in the 60s, which I'm old enough to remember. um, in that the demonstrations in the 60s were always in particular cities. So one, it would erupt in one city, and then another city would follow, and so on. But it was rarely simultaneously national, where you had demonstrations in 150 cities all over the country. That didn't happen in the 60s. So it's genuinely national, the realization that there's something profoundly wrong. And, so that's a radically new moment in America. Secondly, it's become multiracial. You know, this is fascinating. If you look back at the videos from the 60s, you'll get the occasional demonstration which you see prominent white folks marching arm in arm with Martin Luther and so on. But if you look behind them, it's almost all Black. It's a Black movement and a Black thing. Fascinating about what's happening now is that all the young people and even some middle-aged people from different ethnicities join in because they realize that racism is something that matters as much to them as it does to Black people, that it's systemic. That's part of that realization. I think it's profound because as long as you think that racism is just a problem for Black people and not a problem of America and the American system, you're going to be tinkering. So let's make some reforms. Okay, let's appoint a few Black people in the police force. Let's appoint a few Black executives and so on. And that's it. We move on. I think it's reflected in these demonstrations the fact that there's something profoundly wrong with America. And racism is itself connected with other profound problems in America, one of which is the obscene level of inequality that exists in America. And the fact that there won't be any change in America until we do something about the high level of inequality and the absence of any kind of security that's in almost all the other rich countries. Remember, America is unique in all sort of ways. It's unique in the fact that it has a substantial Black population, that it had a history of slavery, which no other white society had. And it's a recognition that the fact that America does not take care of its own, that it doesn't have a welfare state, the way in which all the advanced countries have, all of Western Europe, all of Japan, all of the newly emerging countries, Korea and Australia and others, have basic rock bottom security for its population. America doesn't. Now, people are beginning to recognize this and make the connection because this radical movement is also against police brutality, is also taking place in the midst of a pandemic. And that pandemic has brought to the fore the inadequacies, the deep inadequacies of this society in taking care of its people's health, which every other rich country recognizes as something which you, as a gift, as a generous action, but as a right. So it's fascinating that the two have come together, that we have recognized that experiences of Black Americans, in a sense, are symptomatic, and more than that, is illustrative of the other inadequacies in society. So we're at a moment now where people, middle-aged people, are recognizing that they're profoundly wrong in this society. And what happened with Floyd is was a catalyst. People saw the fact that it came in the context of a pandemic. And it's significant that people have come out. You would have thought that this is the least likely moment in which you would have a demonstration. People should be saying, hey, I can't go demonstrate. I might lose my life. I might catch this disease. And but they're not. They're not, because they're considering it so important that they're prepared to risk their life, go out and demonstrate. So I see coming together a recognition of the fact that America is a profoundly troubled society, that there's systemic problems of inequality, which is tied to that racism is part of this wider systemic problem in American society. And that's why they're out there, because they're seeing this not just as a problem of Blacks, but that in fixing this problem of police brutality, of racism, you have to fix also the wider problem of systemic inequality, of a society that is punitive, of a state that has become carceral, so carceral, imprisons so many of its people that it imprisons more than any other state in the history of the world. All of these things I think have come together at this moment. And that's why I see this as a profoundly radical moment. A possibility of change exists here, which would have significant, profound consequences for Black America, because it exhausted the possibilities of reform. If there's going to be any significant, substantial change in the condition of America, we have to go beyond just tinkering and reforming and throwing a few bucks there and a few million bucks there. We have to make profound changes. And I think there is a sense that, an awareness that this is the moment. And I'm hoping, maybe I'm being too optimistic.
No, I think that you're very adequate. First of all, thank you for your analysis. Michael, this moment that Dr. Patterson has described very well analyzed, how do we take this moment and move it into a movement that can really bring about a revolutionary change rather than a partial surface change? The question of reform versus revolution, the question of reform versus systemic institutional and society change. How do you see it from your perspective? I know you deal with a lot of our millennial brothers and sisters. But what is the thinking? What is the possibility that we can make this not just a moment that we all agree on, but how can we take steps in the light of this moment to bring about real change?
I think the first step is really to dig into liberation and start to defining what liberation means for us. An important step when we begin to talk about liberation fundamentally is about the right for self-determination. Many of America's suburbs, you see how the right for self-determination plays itself out when it is whites and economic elites who are trying to decide what they want in their community, how their community functions, who's allowed, who's not allowed. They exercise the right for self-determination very easily, right? And even if that means segregation, even if that means redlining, even if that means police profiling, even if that means detainment, even if that means eviction, they very quickly organize themselves to legally justify their right for self-determination to have what they want. And I think particularly if we're going to talk about liberation, right, we need to, at Black liberation, let's be very specific about that, we need to assert and double down, triple down on the right for self-determination and really move into a situation of self-governance. We have models in like Jackson, Mississippi, and for example, we have models where the governance and the decision-making happen by the people the closest to the result and the people who are the most impacted every day. And we're lucky that we have elected officials like Assemblywoman Walker here who, you know, believe in that and stay close to community. But we need to continue to emphasize that in a revolutionary moment like this, that what we're fighting for is not just emancipation from unjust, unequitable legal statutes, but we're fighting for the right for self-determination. The second thing really quick in this revolutionary moment, moving beyond emancipation to the liberation and freedom framework, not only is it about self-governance, but I think the second critical point is to fight back on what the politics of surveillance is. And the politics of surveillance is really around understanding that it's not just about what law enforcement accuses you of per se, but it's about the entire apparatus of the society that is constantly watching, controlling, collecting information about you to then create a narrative about you, to then create a case about you. And it's not just about what we find in discovery, but it's about the accumulation of information to be used to mischaracterize and ultimately to pressure you. You could go many days. I mean, Khalif Browder is a classic example of this, right? You could go many, many days fighting against the misinformation without even precision about the accusation. You could go many, many days fighting the misinformation without the system being precise about the accusation against you. And that's politics of surveillance becomes really critical. We have to, in our protests, we have to really get sharp about it's not just the police brutality and the violence. That's absolutely a humanity case, but the entire mechanisms of the structure until we get to the point of liberation and we have self-determination, sovereignty, autonomy, and self-governance, the infrastructure that we're living in now, that surveillance being used to detain us absolutely positively has to be dismantled. Our communities cannot live through more gang raids, our quote unquote gang raids. Our communities cannot continue to live through the way the justice system quote unquote separates families, right? Through social welfare and adoption and foster care. These destabilizing things that hurt our liberation is a product of hyper surveillance. That infrastructure that makes it legally permissible has to be destroyed. The last point for liberation is, you know, the causality of all of this really needs to be interrogated. And this is particularly where folks who are either self-educating and doing it in groups online digitally through social media, or if you're officially in school or in a class, the educational component around why this situation of inequality and racial inequality and oppression exists, we have to get really precise about that. And my last point on this is that America believes in compound interest. America believes in compound growth. But when it comes to the compound effect of brutality, the compound effect of racism, the compound consequences of oppression, it doesn't believe in it anymore. It's like history stops the compound accumulation of what we're facing, and that there's no social economic explanation. It's just good actors and bad actors. And so we really have to dismantle that and really get back to understanding how this apparatus has been created in order to liberate our minds, to not reproduce that, but also to be very, very precise on what we are fighting for to change the infrastructure of the system and have the better reality in the future.
Thank you, Michael. Let me ask Assemblywoman Walker, what do you see? You're an elected official, you're in the state legislature, but you also have your pulse on what is happening in the 55th district, in the heart of Brooklyn. What do you see, Assemblywoman Walker? Do you hear me?
I can hear you. So I proudly represent the neighborhood that I was born and raised in, which is Brownsville, Brooklyn. Of course, East New York, East Flatbush, Crown Heights, Ocean Hill, Bushwick, Bed-Stuy. And so you're right. There are these neighborhoods do encompass the heart of Central Brooklyn, Black Brooklyn. And when I first got elected, one of the things that I was told by the Department of Corrections was that 25,000 people were going to be returning home to my district over the course of 5 years. My community,
25,000?
25,000 individuals, right? Individuals who are going to need health care, housing, job opportunities in order to prevent recidivism, to go back into a system that, oppress them and really just, strip them away from their manhood, away from their families. And what is it that we could have done to be able to stop that? Some of the experiences that they've had, just like Khalif Browder, where they were held on bail unjustifiably without ever being convicted of anything, but being forced to take pleas to charges and go upstate to prison for charges most people have never actually even committed. I can't begin to tell you how many people walk into the doors of our office who tell me that they did 25 years in prison on a case that they never committed and eventually was freed from all of those accusations. And now what's left? A lawsuit. The money might work, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they were put into solitary confinement. Pinpoint in case there. That's something that we can do now legislatively to prevent people, once they are incarcerated, from having to go through the experience of solitary confinement. I heard, Brother Michael talk about the gang raids. They come out and collect in my community 60, 70, 80 young people from the ages of 12 to 25 at a time. And what are they being charged with? Because it's 4, 2, 3 young people sitting on the corner, they're considered to be in a gang. So again, a number of these things are some of the opportunities that we can go in and change from now. I want to get rid of disorderly conduct as a charge, period, point blank, full stop, because it has been utilized as a tool for mass incarceration of our young people. I want to get rid of the charge of obstructing government administration. Again, another very simple, minuscule charge, but it's utilized as a tool to wrap our young people up within the system. And once you start that life of criminal or criminality, it never ends. And so I believe that this is a very important time for us to go and sort of break down the strongholds that the laws that they've been able to use to effectuate mass incarceration on our people. And I think that's a very, one of the things that Dr. King, I know he mentioned, we talked about liberation, reformation, revolution, but we haven't mentioned reconciliation yet. And once we change all these laws, once the protests have stopped, and I hope they never stop, but where do we go from there? Are we still going to be looking, eye to eye at white people and me mugging and saying, is there ever going to be a point where we will be able to, to live in a society that doesn't, look at my baby and babies just like mine to say that, this person right here is going to wind up on welfare and have children that's never going to amount to anything? Or are we now going to be looked at as equal individuals and live in a society which is equitable? It doesn't even have to be equal, but as long as everybody is afforded the same opportunities to be able to be prosperous citizens in America, then I think that we've come a long way. So again, I think that there is still a long road ahead of us legislatively. Like, we're going back to Albany. We are not done yet. One of the things that happened with bail reform, we were able to free tens of thousands of individuals from having to be stuck within Rikers Island or pretrial detention. But the powerful special interests of the PBA, of the Sergeants Associations, of the district associations, they started this reign of terror attacking elected officials who began to quiver on, things that they know are fair and just. So it's my hope too, as well, once we get beyond this point and we've abandoned the chokehold, we have instituted a special prosecutor and special investigators in other situations. But what happens when the PBA starts fanning that $1.4 million or $1 billion that they're going to be having to come after these elected officials? Are we still going to see the quivering, or will this be also a political liberation moment for elected officials? And we have more Black elected officials in the state of New York than any other state in the union. But what are we going to do in order to hold on to that power is what's going to be important. So I can encourage people more than now to vote and, of course, to answer the census.
That's a great segue. I wanted to get Kenneth Montgomery just to chime in since he's a lawyer. Then I'll come to you, Dr. Patterson. But I just want to say to Congresswoman Walker, I'm calling you Congresswoman Walker, Assemblywoman Walker, Black people in America, we spend over $1 trillion in this economy. We have to also free our own politicians. Elected officials ought to be, the reason why the Police Benevolent Society has so much power, because they raise money and they spend money. They hold people accountable to their tactics and to their strategies. I always believe that Black freedom is not free. If we wait for somebody else to pay for our freedom, we're never going to be free. We have to, part of being liberated is taking responsibility for our liberation and not depending on the benevolence of our former slave masters or their slave masters' grandchildren to fund our freedom struggle. I mean, I'm just going to say it's sideways that all what we're dealing with now with the police, in my view, is a tip of a very larger iceberg. It's just not a police problem. It is symptomatic and emblematic of a much deeper problem. But let me say, Attorney Montgomery, then I'll get back to Brother Patterson.
I'm just absorbing everything that's being said. First, you're absolutely right, Dr. Chavez. It's the tip of the iceberg. The reason why the police are allowed with no accountability to kill and destroy Black lives is because it has a system that supports it. If every white person in America woke up tomorrow and decided that they were going to no longer be complicit in racism and white supremacy, the system still would produce racist results. That's how complex it is. So a lot of things need to happen. Firstly, I think this is a defining moment for people who are in this country who are Black because of, here's one. We have been conditioned to think that the closer we get to whiteness, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an academic, whether you're a politician, we may be able to change something systemically. If we could get that seat at the table. This is a defining moment because I think for the youth and the people who are younger, they're looking at this and they're going to have further analysis of that, because that has not been working. Jay-Z having a great career and being the darling and on Madison Avenue, where the NFL wants to do business with him and this company wants to do business with him, and social justice does not change what's happening on the ground in Brownsville or Gary, Indiana, or Compton or Chicago, where all these systemic issues exist. And a part of the thing that's really concerning for me is that there has to be an ideology that rises out of this, an ideology that addresses or puts Black people in a position where they can control their ecosystem. They can begin creating curriculums for their children and educating their children. They can begin to start forming political parties and apparatuses that steps over the corruption that's very deeply embedded in American politics. Because what's happening at the same time at this moment, because we can't forget, we're going to have an economic situation soon that's going to really, if we think the pandemic highlighted the systemic issues, the economic pandemic that we're going to go into is going to further highlight them. And we're dealing with capitalism in its advanced stages. We are the cogs of at least American capitalism. There was no bigger king than cotton, and that was on our backs. We are the essential workers who are dying at a rate greater than everyone else. So you have all those problems, and now you have advanced stage capitalism that isn't working out for white people. So the ideology and the thought that has to come out of this moment has to be focus. And one of the problems that I have personally that I'm still dealing with is that for Black people, we've been brilliant. We've survived. We've met adversity. We've dealt with generational trauma. This moment also highlights to me that we're somehow always on the world stage trying to clean our house. And it does invite others. It does invite people who you have to sometimes check their motive, but they're concerned about our plight as well. But it's very difficult to clean your house on the world stage. And this, while this is going on, what needs to be going on, which we have forgotten as a people, at least in America, is grassroots organization. I shouldn't say we've forgotten. America waged a war against Black people in the 60s and the 70s. And we saw what happened as a result of that. And that war that they waged was really preventing communities from growing and having a self-determination. So any ideology, any movement that's going on right now, it has to be towards self-determination. If we're not educating our children, if we're not grooming the next assemblywoman like Ms. Walker, then what are we doing? We're essentially still at bay because I don't think the New York City Police Department has a budget of $5 billion. That probably is more than many budgets of numerous hundreds of cities in this country. The New York City Police Department is one of the most strongest political forces in this city. And from a national level, the police are, listen, Barack Obama had a close friend who was in the Black Ivory Tower who was profiled, Henry Louis Gates. And there was a moment in time where he came out and he said something towards that. And less than 24 hours, that national police organization had the president of the American Empire sitting in the Oval Garden having a beer with the cop who profiled his friend, and they all sat at that table, and the police controlled that narrative. And during his time, kids were just getting killed. America is very efficient at controlling the narrative. If they don't crush you, which they're very good at, crushing an ant with a sledgehammer, then they also will usurp your message and your narrative. So the messaging and the narrative has to be clear, and that should be going towards controlling our ecosystem.
Gotcha.
And
that's very important. Dr. Patterson?
I agree with nearly everything that's said, but let me just say there are several things, several levels at which we operate. So the short term, the medium, and the long term. We've been dealing with the fundamental medium and long term issues that must be addressed and which I think people are aware of now. But I want to, and I think this addresses the Congresswoman, the Assemblywoman Walker is involved as an assembly person with what can be done immediately and how we can take advantage of the moment to make immediate short-term changes that are essential and which may even promote the medium and long-term changes which we have been talking about here. And that takes us back to the police, the face of the state, and what Assemblywoman Walker and her colleagues can do right now, and what this moment offers. And I want to, if we could just take a little time to focus on this, what this opportunity, what this moment offers Assemblywoman the possibility of doing. And then we can get back to the more fundamental issues which are essential later on. There have been lots of studies, good studies out there on what how we can change the police in very important ways. One of them is to not just defund, that's something which has been specified, but to reduce the kind of things, activities which we were given over to the police. And we're becoming a police state in terms of the number of things which policemen do in this country, which they don't do in other countries. So one of the things which Assemblywoman Walker, I think, can become involved with and which we should help her with is to remove from the police force a lot of things which they're doing now and develop agencies to do these things. The police should not be getting involved with, excuse me, mental health issues. If you see if someone has gotten into trouble because they're clearly are having a problem, a health problem, a mental health problem, it's not the police whom we should call. It should be other agencies taking care of it. The police should not be involved with the kind of homelessness, with domestic issues and so on. In other words, a lot of that $5 billion, which is being spent on the New York police, should be taken from them to develop agencies who, when we have a crisis, we call these agencies rather than the police. That's number one. So instead of talking generally about defunding the police, I'd like Assemblywoman Walker to say, these are the 6, 7, 8 things which the police are now doing, which they shouldn't be doing. This should be done by the community, and we're going to take this money from them to develop these agencies within the communities. And we have examples of this. In a way, this is what we've heard of the Boston Miracle. I don't want to exaggerate it. We've also heard of what's happening in Camden, which are two interesting cases where activities which the police did are then taken over by churches, by organizations, and so on. So when someone mistakenly called the police said, okay, this is really something for a minister within the community to do. So we want to think about what are these activities which we're going to take away from the police and take away the funding for these activities in the police. It may well amount to half of the $5 billion, which will then go into the Black communities. Okay, we want to think about what these may be, and we've been a lot of words researching that. Secondly, we want, and Assemblywoman Walker has already mentioned this, there are too many activities people do for which they're arrested, which they shouldn't be arrested for. In other countries, they're not. You come and see a man sleeping in his car because he thinks responsibly that perhaps he's had one too many, therefore I won't risk the lives of people. I'm going to park my car, I'm going to lay down and sleep a bit till I recover. You shouldn't call the police. Or if the police turn up, what they should do is say, well, I'll drive you home. Not, I'm going to arrest you. This is preposterous. In no other country in the world would a man who decides that he's going to take a nap because, he's had one too many end up being killed by the police. And so we should reduce. There are a large number. And here, the attorney Montgomery can speak more directly to that. There are just a large number of offensive, so-called offenses, which should not be offenses. And we got to clear them off the books, Assemblywoman Walker. I mean, just get a committee to tell you. There are hundreds of things which the police are arresting people for, which in other countries they would not be arrested for. And you can start, Assemblywoman Walker, by saying, look, this list of activities, I'm going to see that the police are no longer involved with, because, I mean, in any civilized society, you shouldn't be arresting a person for this.
Eric Garner was choked to death because he was selling Lucy cigarettes. Choked to death.
Absolutely. This is ridiculous.
Lord was choked to death because he was trying to buy cigarettes and they thought it was a false $20 bill. Choked to death. The brother down in Atlanta, shot in the back twice because he fell asleep at a Wendy's restaurant. So some of this is also, we got to deal with the inhumanity of the police. I think my friend James Baldwin once told me, if you want to change the narrative, we have to write the narrative. You can't expect the organs of the system of oppression to define our reality in a way that gives the liberation or the self-determination to our people. Yeah. The first act of self-determination is to define the reality for oneself, for one's people.
Yes.
And hold on to it without ever permitting it to be altered by the forces of oppression. So I think, one of the benefits of this panel, Assemblywoman Walker, is that we have these touch points that now have come out, how we can follow through with them so that your colleagues in the state legislature, so that brothers and sisters who are organizing at the street level, so other progressive attorneys like Attorney Montgomery and professors like um, Dr. Patterson and educators like Brother Pontus, that we find a way how to put this together. You know, there's a contradiction at a certain point where we make a moral appeal to the immoral, or that we demand justice, freedom, and equality from those who are incapable of rendering it. So I just want to make sure that all of the listeners, and I'm getting a lot of stuff now on social media. One of the benefits of technology is just not the 5 or 6 of us to talking about this. We're stimulating discussion, thinking, raising consciousness, but it needs to be followed through on even after Juneteenth. To me, Black History Month should be every month, not just February.
Right.
Liberation Day has to be every day, not one day, well, one memorial. And if we just think about all the brothers and sisters who've had their lives taken away, extinguished, it is our responsibility in their spirit not only to keep their memories alive, but to push forward so that we won't have these circumstances where it takes a tragedy like what happened to Brother Floyd to reawaken us of our responsibility. I think there's been so many, and I think the cultural, one of the things we have not touched on is our cultural artists. See, I remember when NWA and Public Enemy said F the police in their music, was a forewarning. And I think that we need to talk about the police not being invincible. I think that we need to hold them accountable, all of them. And I know there's some good brothers and sisters who work in the police who also are struggling within that structure to try to make a difference. So I know that we got a few more minutes left, but I would like for each of you to give Assemblywoman Walker what you think your recommendations are so that she could utilize them going forward. Brother Partridge, I'm going to start with you.
I think my recommendation, really important, is we need to decriminalize how we look at youth behavior, specifically Black youth behavior. The school to prison pipeline has created a way through school safety agents and policing in schools and following people after school and creating records. It's created a way to not only demoralize young people from attending school, which is a part of the alienation point that Brother Montgomery mentioned, but it also becomes a mechanism to push them out of the economy, to push them to be socially alienated, and then to criminalize their quote unquote disconnection. So the whole apparatus that takes young men to be quote unquote in gangs, that takes students who misbehave in school to be quote unquote expendable and have to expel them, that whole apparatus of extracting young people from a very young age and putting them into a system to be criminalized, from ACS, which is a bit more controversial but real, from ACS through school system, through how we police our young, quote unquote, police our young people on the street. If we can dismantle the school to prison pipeline and the really Black youth to prison pipeline, that would be important. Some of that is about putting money into different places, but some of that is about legislation that absolutely will not allow destabilizing Black families, Black households, Black communities. Because when that destabilizing happens, all the collateral consequences that justify violence and policing occur. So we can really get tight on legislation to not morally sanctioned, and then to destabilize those families through school to prison pipeline and those other youth to prison pipelines, for me, that's like number one on the list.
All right, thank you so much. Attorney Montgomery.
I think I'm going to concur with that. I think, as Dr. Patterson stated, and it's a historical reason for it, Black communities have always been over policed. And the reason being is because our behavior was looked at pathologically, even though that they knew that this system was the reason, which is white supremacy, why our neighborhoods were suffering in the way we were suffering. Their answer to it was more police. So you have police to deal with mental health, police to deal with homelessness, police to deal with whatever you name it. Police is the answer. And that budget just ballooned and ballooned and ballooned till we have what we have now. So I think we need people who are committed, like Assemblyman Walker and others, to form a coalition to start decriminalizing. And you mentioned it, disorderly conduct. I can give you about 100,000 more of the crimes that we can get off of the books, but that needs to happen. This whole conversation coming from the White House about law and order, law and order, law and order, that's just racist dog whistling, in my opinion. But we have to decriminalize. And as Brother Michael just said, the school to prison pipeline, in America, we incarcerate something around 2.5 million people, only being 5% of the world's population. America represents 25% of the world's prison population. That is an efficient algorithm that's doing that. And it's the police are just the foot soldiers to that. It's these policies. So we have to have these decriminalize these laws, but simultaneously, and if not more, we have to have meaningful programs in the community from a grassroots perspective with education, supplemental education, mentoring programs, apprenticeship programs, because unfortunately in this day and age, with the inundated messaging that our children are getting all the time, we live in a society where crime has been commodified, where young people are listening, as Dr. Chavis just mentioned, the music should be inspiring and provoking thought. The music in some degree is sort of selling dysfunction. And to get our young people where their cultural default is not the Breakfast Club or rap music or this video, their default is that program that they ran into when they were in between the ages of 5 to 12, and they learned how to code. They learned how to be an architect. They got into the arts. They learned how to do a mock trial. That will offset the what consumerism and what America wants them to do and the narrative that they want them to do. So less police, more programs. And it's something that I don't know how this can happen, but I would love to see the stakeholders in the community, an intergenerational approach, start neighborhood policing, not in the sense that say we're going to be the new cops in our neighborhood, but have a presence in the community where the grandmother or the mother who's working or the father who's working, they feel comfortable with their children outside because they know as a community, there now is a neighborhood glue and patrol that is ensuring that the kids are safe. When these police officers come, there's a lot of eyes on them for accountability, because what happens is police officers come into our neighborhoods and they know there is no accountability. And we have to somehow create that accountability. But I think all of those things need to happen, and they can happen. It just requires effort and ideology.
Very good. Dr. Patterson, you started the list and you can conclude.
Couldn't agree with Mr. Montgomery more. So 3 or 4 things, Assemblywoman Walker. One, which has been emphasized by all of us here, decriminalize and communalize. That is to say, you decriminalize activities which are now subject to enforcement and hand them over to the community, as they were doing in Camden, as they did in Boston and elsewhere. We have models of that, number one. Number two, we will have offenses. People will commit offenses, okay? And especially if you're poor and you're hemmed in sort of ghettos with sort of, sort of high density of poverty and so on, you will get offenses. But what you want to do is, in addressing these offenses, you do not take a punitive approach. America has gotten itself in a situation where if you commit an offense, you're going to be punished. That doesn't necessarily follow, because you recognize that people are committing these offenses because very often they don't have any alternatives. Very often they are hungry or whatever the reasons. There are lots of offenses which you can say, well, we will not take a carceral punitive approach. So that's number two. Number three, it has been shown in repeated research, and this point is important, that one of the main factors driving the high incarceration rate, and Attorney Montgomery will know this, has to do with the number of arrests which police make, and that in fact, a lot of times, if the police has an encounter with someone, their reaction is to arrest them, to put them in jail. Now, this may seem a very simple point, but it's very important. In a lot of other countries, when the police encounter someone, they have the option to do many different things, only one of which is arresting them. Now, it's interesting in that case in Atlanta. The police's first instinct is, we're going to arrest you. There are 6 or 7 different things the police could have done instead of, putting on the handcuffs. But that is the immediate response and almost the only response of the police. We ought to, and this is different from the earlier points. I mean, that is, you see someone does something which may be irregular and so on. You think of alternate ways. You can hand them over, so you can drive him home. You can hand him over to some other organ. That's important. The other critical thing which has emerged is that 911 has become a real problem. 911 sees its role mainly as a sort of gateway to the police. But 911 should be doing a whole lot of other things. If someone rings and said, I'm really having problems with someone here who seems to be a little bit off and so on, you don't call the police to deal with that mental health issue. 911 should know, no, I don't call the police. I call the mental health authority. Or if someone is homeless and is sort of trying to sleep underneath my steps and so on, and you feel uncomfortable with that, when you call 911, they don't send the police, they send whoever it is who deals with people who are homeless and so on. 911, it turns out, is a major problem, and it has to be reformed so that people are trained to funnel problems, not to the police, but to any number of other agencies who will take care of it. Now, those are simple, direct problems you can do right now. Another important factor, Assemblywoman Walker, is to disincentivize the police from making arrests. The system is now set up, and again, Attorney Montgomery will know this, that in fact it's in the interest of the police to make arrests.
Yes.
All sort of things. For example, having court time means more money for them. Yeah. Doing overtime means money for them. You know what some police people do? They wait until they're almost time for them to go off duty, and that's when they make their arrest. Why? Because they know they'll get overtime. I mean, this is just an unbelievable system, and so restructuring the police so that they do not have that incentive becomes very important. So these are some simple things which I said they're short term. They relate to the police and things you can do immediately. They do not obviate all the other things which we pointed out, the more fundamental kind of thing, the whole change in the police culture, and the way in which, in fact, and again, Attorney Montgomery mentions the community itself, which we cannot neglect. It's what sociologists, what he describes is what sociologists call the sort of communal efficacy. Having a system in which you don't need the police because trust each other, to look after each other, and so on. That has got to be part of the package too. So we don't even need the police in our community. So these are just some specific things which we can do right now, in addition to the more fundamental things that we talked about earlier, reducing inequality, massive reduction in the whole attitude towards punishment. And I agree with Brother Partis that one of the failures of the Obama administration was not to address directly this problem of incarceration. He should have reduced that population by a half at the very least, rather than just tinkering at the edges. And but right, we can do immediately, Assemblywoman Walker, these things which we've just, Attorney Montgomery and our parties have proposed. And I hope you will sort of get together with your colleagues to do that right now.
So, Attorney Montgomery, Brother Partis, and Dr. Passon, thank you so much. And Assemblywoman Walker, please know that I intend to make sure that all the Black newspapers in America cover this issue. We have to raise the consciousness of our people and give them insights to what some of the remedies should be. I think that when our young people are chanting Black Lives Matter, when they're chanting defund the police, when they're chanting no justice, no peace, and other assertions that come from their sense to be vocal and to be moving and to be active, I think all that is positive. What we have a responsibility to do is to keep pushing, keep demanding, and not become frustrated. Social change in America does not happen overnight. Reforming, revolutionizing this system, 400, 500-year system, it is possible, no question about it, to change. But it requires a constant struggle. It requires a constant effort on our part. So, Assemblywoman Walker, thank you so much. We owe you a special expression of gratitude for coming up with this idea. And rest assured, we'll be there. You know, if you have to have hearings up in Albany, let us know on these issues. We'll be there. We'll be there to help you in any way we can, in the street and in the halls of the legislature. But most importantly, I think what is coming out of tonight is that there are solutions, that the forces that are arrayed against us are not invincible, they're not impenetrable. And out of our unity, out of our resolve, out of our commitment, we will begin to make a difference. So once again, thank you so much. And thank all of the my colleagues. I think it's been a great discussion.
Well, I'll definitely say that, in the spirit of what we've seen a lot of riddles on social media, what do we get? What do you get when you have a civil rights giant, a Harvard academic, a practitioner, and a revolutionary at the table? And the answer that I have to that are marching orders. And I appreciate the recommendations that everyone has. I hope and trust that all of our listeners are also taking notes as I was, because again, Juneteenth uh, is a point in history that we are acknowledging our liberation from slavery. But we heard you at the onset of this conversation. Freedom ain't free. And if we are going to make sure that we hold on to any semblance of freedom that we've been able to accomplish and go get everything else that's owed to us, that we need to have the prescription by which to do so. And I believe that we got a definite process by which to begin that from your recommendations today. So I thank each and every one of you. Tomorrow's conversation is going to be about estate and financial planning. So we hope that you will join in with us. We will begin the conversation tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. And right here at the same location. And that will be our third day of our week-long Juneteenth master classes. So thank you so much, and God bless each and every one of you. And I see
God
Dr.
bless you.
Patterson.
Thank you.
Can I just add one little hopeful note there? Now that several people have mentioned Juneteenth, the president of Harvard just announced today that Juneteenth will be a holiday at Harvard from now on, starting.
Oh, wow. Amazing, amazing, amazing. So, you know, from as you say, from the streets of Brownsville to the halls of justice, we are really making some inroads. So I'm sure that's a testimony to some of the great work that you're doing there, Dr. Patterson. So thank you. And don't forget, we need to be getting out there voting. Early voting is happening right now in New York through June 21st. Election day is June 23rd, and we still have an obligation to answer our census. Our census response rate right now is at 41%. So I am encouraging everyone to go out and make us all proud, make our ancestors proud, and definitely answer the census. Thank you.
Thank you.
Free the land. Thank you all.
All right. God bless.
All right,
Stay
thank you.
strong.